3 days passed in the cold prison cell before Commander Drac decided it was time to break the human prisoner park. Jay had been sitting quietly in his cell watching the guards and learning their routines, but the aliens thought he was just another scared colonist waiting to surrender. The interrogation room was in a different part of the ship, and Jay was dragged there by two guards who seemed to enjoy pulling him roughly through the corridors. The room was bare except for a metal chair bolted to the floor and bright lights that hurt his eyes. When he looked up, Commander Drac was waiting for him with Lieutenant Vex standing nearby. Both aliens looked pleased with themselves, as if they had already won some kind of victory. The guards chained Jay to the chair and stepped back to watch the show. Drac walked around the chair slowly, like a predator circling its prey. He spoke in his grinding voice, asking questions about human military strength and the locations of other colonies. Jay listened carefully to every word but did not answer. The alien commander seemed surprised by the silence. Most prisoners started talking immediately when they saw the interrogation room. Some begged for mercy while others tried to make deals, but Jay just sat there with his dark eyes following every movement. Vex grew impatient with the lack of progress. He activated a small device that sent waves of pain through Jay's body. The electricity felt like fire running through his veins, and his muscles twitched uncontrollably, but he did not scream or cry out. The lieutenant increased the power, and Jay felt his vision blur from the agony. His body wanted to collapse, but he forced himself to stay upright. The pain was terrible, but he had felt worse during his military training on Earth. Drac asked more questions about human defenses and colony ship routes, but Jay remained silent. This seemed to confuse the aliens, who were used to breaking prisoners within minutes. They had tortured many different species, and all of them had eventually talked. Hours passed and the torture continued, but Jay endured everything they did to him. He focused on breathing and staying conscious while memorizing every detail about his captors. He noticed that Vex favored his left hand and that Drac had a limp in his right leg. The aliens brought in different torture devices, hoping to find something that would make the human talk. They used heat and cold and chemicals that burned his skin, but Jay had been trained to resist interrogation, and he knew how to separate his mind from his body. What the Vakari did not understand was that Jay was not just a maintenance engineer. Before joining the colony ship, he had been a sergeant in the Korean Special Forces. He had survived training that would have killed most people and had fought in wars that few humans even knew about. The interrogation sessions became a daily routine, and each time the aliens grew more frustrated with their failure to break him. They tried psychological torture, showing him pictures of destroyed human colonies and talking about what they would do to any survivors. They found Jay absorbed all this information while pretending to be affected by their threats. He was learning about Vakari military operations and colony locations, information that might be useful if he ever escaped, but escape was not really his plan anymore. During one session, Drac brought in a recording device and played sounds of humans screaming from other ships. The alien commander explained that these were colonists from the ship New Soul who had been captured alive and were now being sold as slaves. This was the first time Jay showed any emotion, and his hands clenched into fists when he heard the familiar voices, but he still did not speak. Instead, he filed away the information about slave markets and processing centers for later use. The guards started to make bets about how long the human would last before breaking. Some thought he would give up within a week, while others believed he might hold out for a month. None of them considered that he might never break at all. Between interrogation sessions, Jay was returned to his cell, where he continued studying the ship and its crew. He learned the names of the guards and their individual weaknesses. He mapped the corridor layout in his mind and identified potential weapons and escape routes. The other prisoners in nearby cells were from different alien species that had been conquered by the Vakari Empire. Most of them had been broken by torture and sat in hopeless silence. But sometimes they would whisper warnings to Jay about what was coming. A Zephyrian prisoner named Cole had been in the cells for months and had watched dozens of interrogations. He told Jay that no one had ever resisted the Vakari torture methods for more than a few days. The aliens always found a way to break their prisoners, but Jay was different, and the other prisoners began to notice it too. He did not show fear or despair like the others. Instead, he seemed to grow stronger and more focused with each passing day. This gave some of the prisoners hope, even though they did not understand why the interrogation sessions grew more violent as Drac and Vex became desperate to get information from their stubborn prisoner. They brought in new torture devices and tried experimental pain techniques that they had developed on other species. Jay endured everything they did to him, while secretly studying their methods and equipment. He was learning how their weapons worked and how their technology could be turned against them. The aliens thought they were breaking him, but he was actually preparing for war during one particularly brutal session. Vex made a mistake and got too close while adjusting a torture device. Jay could have grabbed the lieutenant's weapon and tried to fight his way out, but he held back. The timing was not right yet. The guards started to respect the human prisoner. Despite themselves, they had never seen anyone resist torture for so long, and some of them began to wonder if there was something special about this particular human, but their commanders just saw his resistance as a challenge to overcome. Edrak decided to try a different approach and brought in a Vakari scientist who specialized in breaking difficult prisoners. The scientist examined Jay like a laboratory specimen and suggested new methods of psychological torture. They showed him holographic images of Earth being destroyed and told him that human colonies were being wiped out across the galaxy, but Jay had already suspected this might happen, and the news just made his resolve stronger. The scientist tried to inject him with drugs that were supposed to make him more cooperative, but Jay's body seemed to resist the chemicals better than expected. This puzzled the aliens, who had never encountered such resistance to their serums. By the end of the second week, the interrogation sessions had become a battle of wills between the human prisoner and his alien captors. Drac was becoming obsessed with breaking Jay and spent hours thinking of new ways to torture him, but Jay was using the time to complete his preparations. He had memorized the ship's layout and identified the key systems that would need to be disabled. He had studied every guard and knew their strengths and weaknesses. He was ready for the next phase of his plan. The aliens still saw him as a defeated prisoner who would eventually surrender, but they were completely wrong. Jay was no longer thinking about survival or escape. He was thinking about revenge, and he was very good at that. The black space around the destroyed colony ship was full of floating metal pieces and broken dreams. Jay slowly opened his eyes and felt cold air touching his face. He was floating in the dark with only his emergency suit keeping him alive. The ship New Soul was gone, and all he could see were twisted metal parts spinning slowly in the empty space. 3 hours ago, Jay had been working in the engine room fixing a broken pipe when the alarm started screaming. The ship shook so hard that he fell and hit his head on the metal floor. When he got up, the lights were flashing red, and he could hear people screaming in the hallways. Above him, the attack had come without warning. The Vakari warships dropped out of hyperspace like hungry wolves surrounding a lost sheep. The colony ship had no weapons and no way to fight back. The human captain tried to surrender, but the aliens did not care. They wanted to test their new weapons on live targets. Jay remembered running through the corridors, trying to reach the escape pods, but the ship was breaking apart around him. Explosions were everywhere, and the walls were cracking open, letting the cold space air rush in. He made it to an emergency suit locker and put on the gear just as his section of the ship broke away from the main hull. Now he was alone in space, watching pieces of his home drift past him in the darkness. He could see bodies floating nearby, people he had known and worked with for 2 years during the long journey to their new world. Mrs. Kim, who ran the food garden's young student. Men who always asked too many questions about the engines. All of them were dead. Now a bright light suddenly appeared in front of him, and Jay squinted his eyes to see what it was. The light grew bigger, and he realized it was a ship moving toward him. It was not a human ship. The design was wrong, with too many sharp angles and spikes sticking out from the hull. This was a Vakari vessel. The alien ship moved closer, and Jay felt a pulling force grab his body. He tried to swim away, but there was nothing to push against in space. The tractor beam was too strong, and it pulled him toward an opening in the bottom of the ship. He floated through the opening and landed hard on a metal floor. The air around him was warm, but it smelled wrong, like sulfur and rotting meat. Jay got to his feet and looked around the cargo bay. It was bigger than any room on the human ship, with walls that curved up into shadows. The metal was dark red and covered with strange symbols that hurt his eyes to look at. Heavy footsteps echoed in the darkness, and 3 figures walked into the light. Jay had never seen a Vakari before, but he knew what they were from the colony briefings. They were tall, almost 8 feet, with gray, scaly skin that looked like armor. Their heads were long with yellow eyes that glowed in the dark and mouths full of sharp teeth. The leader was wearing a black uniform with metal decorations on the chest. His scales were darker than the others and old scars crossed his face. He looked at Jay like a scientist studying a bug. The other two were carrying weapons that hummed with energy. The leader spoke in a voice that sounded like grinding rocks, but Jay could not understand the words. One of the soldiers pointed a scanner at him, and the device made beeping sounds. The leader looked at the readings and made a sound that might have been laughter. They talked among themselves in their harsh language, and Jay caught a few words he recognized from the translation programs on the colony ship. They were discussing whether he was worth keeping alive or if they should just throw him back into space. The leader made a decision and pointed at Jay. The soldiers moved forward and grabbed his arms. Their claws were sharp and cut through his suit sleeves, but they were careful not to damage him too much. They dragged him out of the cargo bay and through corridors filled with alien technology. The walls were covered with pipes and cables that pulsed with different colored lights. The air was thick and humid, and Jay could hear strange sounds coming from behind closed doors. Sometimes he heard screaming, and he wondered if there were other prisoners on this ship. They passed through several sections before reaching what looked like a prison area. The walls here were plain metal with rows of cells on both sides. Each cell had energy bars instead of solid doors, and Jay could see the power flowing through them like blue lightning. The soldiers threw him into an empty cell, and the energy bars activated with a buzzing sound. Jay tested the barrier carefully and felt electricity shock his fingers. The power was strong enough to kill him if he tried to force his way through. The cell was small, with just enough room to lie down and a hole in the floor for waste. There was no bed or blanket, just the cold metal floor and walls. The only light came from the energy bars, which cast blue shadows on everything. The leader stood outside the cell and spoke again. This time he used broken human words that he must have learned from other prisoners. "You are human," he said slowly. "You are weak. You will tell us about your people, or you will die." Jay looked at the alien commander and did not answer. He was thinking about all the people who had died on the colony ship and wondering if he was the only survivor. The weight of being the last one alive pressed down on him like a heavy stone. The commander waited for a response, but Jay just sat down on the floor and closed his eyes. This made the alien angry, and he barked orders at the soldiers. They left, but Jay could hear them talking in the corridor outside. More aliens came to look at him over the next few hours. They pointed at him and made sounds that were probably laughter. Some of them had weapons, and they showed them to him as if threatening him. Others just stared with their yellow eyes glowing in the darkness. They brought him food that looked like gray paste and tasted like metal, but Jay ate it because he needed to stay strong. He drank the water they gave him, even though it had a strange bitter taste. He was not going to die easily. Night and day had no meaning on the alien ship, but Jay tried to keep track of time by counting the guard changes. He noticed that the soldiers worked in shifts and that they had patterns in their behavior. The lazy one always came first, followed by the mean one who liked to threaten prisoners. Jay began to study his captors without seeming to pay attention. He watched how they moved and how they held their weapons. He listened to their conversations and started to understand more of their language than he let them know. The aliens thought he was just another scared human who would break under pressure. They did not know that before joining the colony ship, Jay had been a soldier. He had fought in wars on Earth and had been trained to survive in impossible situations. More importantly, they did not know that humans had something the Vakari did not understand. They could not see the anger growing inside him or the determination that was getting stronger every day. The aliens thought they had captured a weak prisoner, but they had made a terrible mistake. They had given him time to plan and time to prepare. They had shown him their weaknesses and their routines. They had made him watch as they laughed about destroying his home and killing his friends. The Vakari believed that all species were like them, that they would surrender when faced with superior force. They had conquered many worlds this way, and they expected humans to be the same, but they were wrong. Jay sat quietly in his cell and let them think he was defeated. He let them mock him and threaten him while he studied every detail of their ship. and their behavior. He was not planning to escape, he was planning something much worse. The aliens had destroyed his world and killed his people. Now he was going to make them pay for what they had done. He just needed to wait for the right moment and the right opportunity. In the darkness of his cell, Jay smiled. For the first time since his capture, the aliens thought they had won, but the real fight had not even started. Yet they were about to learn what happened when you pushed a human too far. The days blended together in the alien prison, but Park Jae kept careful track of time by counting guard rotations and meal deliveries. He had been a prisoner for 3 weeks now, and the Vakari crew had settled into a routine of daily torture sessions, followed by long periods of mockery. The guards found new ways to amuse themselves with their human prisoner. They would gather outside his cell during their breaks and make jokes about human weakness. Some threw scraps of food at him, while others made crude drawings showing humans being killed in horrible ways. Jay sat quietly in his corner and watched everything. They thought he was broken and defeated, but he was actually studying them more carefully than ever before. He knew which guards were cruel and which were just following orders. He knew who was smart and who was stupid. Guard Crix was the worst of them all. He took personal pleasure in human suffering and would spend hours describing what the Vakari had done to other human colonies. He talked about families being separated and children being sold to alien slave markets. Warrior Young was strong but predictable. He always did the same patrol route and always checked the energy barriers at the same times. Technician Zul was intelligent but arrogant, and he liked to show off his knowledge about the ship's systems to the other guards. The aliens had made the mistake of thinking that all humans were the same. They had experience with frightened colonists and helpless civilians, but they had never dealt with someone who had been trained to fight back. Their overconfidence was going to be their downfall. Everything changed when they brought in the second prisoner. Park Jae was doing his usual exercise routine when he heard commotion in the corridor outside. The guards were laughing and making excited sounds as they dragged someone new toward the cells. The prisoner was a young human woman who looked to be about 18 years old. She was wearing the torn uniform of a colony ship student, and her face was streaked with tears. The guards threw her into the cell across from Jay's and activated the energy barriers. Her name was Kim So-ra, and she had been hiding in an escape pod when the Vakari found her. She was terrified and confused and kept asking about her parents and younger brother who had been on the colony ship when it was destroyed. The guards took special pleasure in telling her what had happened to her family. They described the attack in graphic detail and explained that everyone on the ship was dead except for the few who had been captured as slaves or prisoners. So-ra broke down crying and collapsed on the floor of her cell. The guards laughed at her pain and made bets about how long she would survive the interrogation process. Some of them made crude comments about what would happen to her in the slave markets. Jay watched all of this with growing anger, but he kept his expression neutral. He could not let the guards know that he cared about another prisoner, or they would use her as leverage against him. But inside he was making new plans. The guards brought So-ra food and water, but they also brought psychological torture. They told her stories about other human prisoners who had been broken by the Vakari methods. They described the slave markets where humans were sold to the highest bidder. So-ra was just a student who had been traveling to the colony with her family to start a new life. She had never seen violence or cruelty like this, and she was not prepared for what the aliens were doing to her. The guards could see her breaking down, and they enjoyed every moment of it. During the night cycles, when the ship was quieter, So-ra would cry softly in her cell, and sometimes she would look across at Jay with desperate hope in her eyes. She seemed to think that this older human might somehow be able to help her. Jay wanted to comfort her, but he could not risk revealing his true capabilities. The guards were always watching and listening for any sign of communication between prisoners. Any attempt to help So-ra would result in worse treatment for both of them. The interrogation sessions continued for both prisoners, but the aliens were more interested in breaking the young woman than getting information from her. They seemed to enjoy her fear and helplessness in a way that made Jay's anger burn hotter. Commander Drac would bring So-ra to the interrogation room just to terrorize her with stories about what happened to human slaves. He would describe the alien markets where humans were bought and sold like animals, and he would laugh when she begged him to stop. Lieutenant Vex was even worse, and he seemed to take personal pleasure In making Sora suffer, he would use mild torture devices on her just to hear her scream, and he would make threats about what would happen to her if she did not cooperate. The other guards started visiting Sora's cell more frequently, and they would make comments about her appearance and age that made Jay's blood boil. They talked about the high prices that young human females brought in the slave market. Sora tried to be brave, but she was just a teenager who had never experienced anything like this before. She would ask the guards about her family and beg them to tell her that some of the colonists had survived, but they just laughed at her. 3 days after Sora's arrival, the guards brought news that made her collapse in despair. They had received confirmation that all escape pods from the colony ship had been destroyed, except for the one she had been hiding in. She was completely alone. That night Sora cried harder than ever before, and her sobs echoed through the prison section. The guards found her grief amusing, and they made jokes about human emotional weakness. They said that humans were too soft to survive in the galaxy. Jay lay on his cell floor and listened to the young woman's crying and felt something fundamental change inside him. He had maintained his discipline through weeks of torture and mockery. But hearing Sora's suffering was different. The girl represented everything the aliens had destroyed. She was innocent and hopeful, and she had done nothing to deserve this treatment. The Vakari were torturing her not for information, but simply because they enjoyed causing pain to humans. For the first time since his capture, Jay felt his carefully controlled anger start to slip. He had been planning to wait for the perfect moment to strike, but watching Sora's suffering made him realize that the perfect moment might never come. The guards had made their biggest mistake by bringing another human prisoner into his sight. They had given him something to fight for beyond his own survival, and they had shown him exactly what kind of creatures they really were. That night, Jay made a decision. He was done waiting and done planning. The time had come to show these aliens what happened when they pushed a human too far. The Vakari thought they knew about human weakness, but they were about to learn about human strength. He stood up in his cell and walked to the energy barrier. For the first time since his capture, the guards who were on duty noticed his movement and came over to see what the human was doing. Jay looked at each guard carefully, and then he spoke to them in their own language using words he had learned from weeks of listening to their conversations. His voice was calm and steady. As he made them a promise, he told them that they had hurt enough humans and that tomorrow things would be different. He said that they would pay for what they had done to his people and to the innocent girl in the cell across from him. The guards laughed at his threats, but there was something in his voice that made them uncomfortable. They had never heard him speak before, and the way he said the words made them feel uneasy. When the guards left for their break, Jay sat down and began his final preparations. He had been holding back for weeks, but now it was time to stop pretending to be a helpless prisoner. The aliens were about to discover what humans were really capable of when they had nothing left to lose. The morning shift began like any other day on the Vakari warship. Guard Crix arrived at the prison section with his usual swagger, expecting to find 2 broken human prisoners waiting for their daily dose of torture and mockery, but something was different about the male prisoner today. Park Jay was standing at the front of his cell instead of sitting in his usual corner. His posture was straight and alert, like a soldier ready for battle. His eyes were focused and intense in a way that made even the experienced Vakari warrior feel uncomfortable. Crix laughed nervously and called for the other guards to come and see the human who was finally showing some spirit. The aliens gathered around the cell and began their usual routine of insults and threats, but Jay did not react the way they expected. Instead of cowering or looking away, Jay stared directly at each guard and seemed to be memorizing their faces. His breathing was controlled and steady, like someone preparing for physical combat. The guards noticed the change, but they did not understand what it meant. Sora was watching from her cell across the corridor, and she could see that something had changed in the older human. He no longer looked like a defeated prisoner. Instead, he looked like someone who had made a dangerous decision. Crix stepped closer to the energy barrier and began making his usual threats about what would happen during the interrogation session. But Jay was not listening to the words. Instead, he was studying the guard's position and looking for weaknesses. Without warning, Jay reached out and grabbed the energy barrier with both hands. The guards expected him to be thrown back by the electrical discharge, but instead he held on tight, his muscles tensed and his face showed pain, but he did not let go. The energy field began to flicker and spark as Jay pulled on it with strength that seemed impossible for a human. The guard stared in shock as he slowly began to tear the barrier apart like it was made of paper instead of pure energy. Crix reached for his weapon, but he was too slow. Jay had been waiting for this moment, and he moved with the speed and precision of a trained killer. The energy barrier collapsed with a sound like breaking glass, and Jay was free. The first guard died before he could even draw his weapon. Jay's fist crushed his throat, and he fell to the floor choking on his own blood. The second guard managed to raise his rifle, but Jay was already moving, and the shot went wide. Jay rolled under the energy blast and came up behind the guard. His hands found the alien's neck and twisted with a sharp crack. The guard dropped his weapon and collapsed with his head at an impossible angle. The third guard was faster and more experienced. He got his weapon up and fired several shots at the human, but Jay seemed to anticipate where the blasts would go. He moved like a dancer, avoiding each shot by inches. The alarm system activated and warning lights began flashing throughout the ship. The guard tried to reach the emergency button, but Jay was already on top of him. The human's fist connected with the alien's skull, and it caved in like an eggshell. Sora was pressed against the back wall of her cell, watching the violence. With wide eyes, she had never seen anything like this before. The quiet maintenance engineer had transformed into something terrifying and magnificent. Jay quickly searched the dead guards for weapons and keys. He found the device that controlled the cell barriers and freed Sora from her prison. The young woman was in shock and could barely speak, but she followed him without question. The corridor outside the prison section was empty, but Jay knew it would not stay that way for long. The alarm was bringing guards from all over the ship, and they would arrive within minutes. He needed to move fast and find a better position. Sora stumbled as they ran through the corridors, but Jay caught her arm and helped her keep up. He had studied the ship's layout during his weeks of imprisonment, and he knew exactly where to go to avoid the main guard stations. They reached a maintenance access tunnel that led to the ship's engineering section. Jay had worked on similar systems during his time on the colony ship, and he knew how to navigate the cramped spaces between the walls. The first hunting party arrived at the prison section. Just as Jay and Sora disappeared into the ventilation system, the guards found 3 of their comrades dead and the human prisoners gone. Their commander was not going to be pleased with this news. Jay led Sora through the maze of pipes and cables that ran throughout the ship. He moved confidently in the darkness while she struggled to keep up. The engineering spaces were hot and humid and filled with the sounds of machinery. They could hear the guards searching the corridors below them, but the aliens did not think to check the maintenance tunnels. The Vakari were used to fighting enemies who attacked directly, not ones who used stealth and misdirection. Jay found an access panel and carefully opened it to look into the corridor beyond. A patrol of 4 guards was moving past, but they were focused on checking the obvious hiding places. They did not notice the human watching them from above. When the patrol passed, Jay dropped down into the corridor and motioned for Sora to follow. He had selected this route carefully because it led to the ship's armory, where he could find better weapons and equipment. The armory was guarded by 2 sentries who were more alert than the prison guards. They had heard about the escape and were ready for trouble, but they were not ready for someone with Jay's training and experience. Jay used a piece of broken pipe as a weapon and attacked the guards from behind. The first one died instantly when the metal crushed his spine. The second guard managed to turn around, but Jay was already swinging again. The armory contained weapons and armor from dozens of different species that the Vakari had conquered. Jay selected a pulse rifle and several grenades while Sora watched the corridor for more guards. He also found a suit of light armor that almost fit him and a helmet with a built-in communication system. Now he could monitor the guards' radio chatter and stay one step ahead of their search parties. The ship's intercom crackled to life, and Commander Drax's voice filled the corridors. He was offering a reward for the capture of the escaped prisoners and threatening punishment for anyone who let them get away. Jay smiled grimly as he listened to the announcement. The aliens still thought they were dealing with a normal prison break. They had no idea that they were now fighting someone who had been trained to kill and had nothing left to lose. Sora was beginning to understand what was happening, and she looked at Jay with new respect. This was not the broken prisoner she had seen in the cell. This was someone who had been Hiding his true nature while he planned his revenge, the hunting parties were getting closer and Jay knew they could not stay in the armory much longer, but he had accomplished his first objective, and now he had the weapons and equipment needed. For the next phase of his plan, he checked his rifle and made sure Sora was ready to move. Again, they would have to navigate through the ship's corridors while avoiding the search teams, but this time, Jay was armed and dangerous and the hunters were about to become the hunted. The real fight was just beginning, and the Vakari were about to learn that humans could be much more dangerous than they had ever imagined. When pushed to their limits, humans did not just survive, they fought back, with a fury that could not be stopped. The alarm bells continued to ring throughout the Vakari warship as Commander Drac organized his response to the prison break. He had dealt with escaped prisoners before, but never from the maximum security detention center. This was supposed to be impossible. Drac sent his best warriors to recapture the humans. He was confident that one escaped prisoner could not pose a real threat to his trained crew. The human had managed to kill a few guards, but that was probably just luck combined with desperation. The first hunting party consisted of 6 heavily armed soldiers led by Sergeant Vok. They moved through the ship, systematically checking every room and corridor. They expected to find the humans cowering in some dark corner waiting to surrender, but the corridors were empty and the security cameras had been disabled. Someone had used the maintenance access tunnels to move through the ship without being detected. This required knowledge of the ship's layout that a prisoner should not have possessed. Jay was watching the hunting party from a ventilation grate above their heads. He had spent weeks studying the guards' tactics, and he knew exactly how they would search for him. The aliens were following standard procedures, which made them predictable. Sora was hidden in a storage room 3 levels down where she would be safe while Jay dealt with the search teams. She had wanted to help, but he knew she would only slow him down in combat. This was his fight now. The hunting party split up to cover more ground, which was exactly what Jay had hoped they would do. He waited until 2 guards were separated from the main group, then dropped down behind them like a shadow. The first guard died without making a sound as Jay's knife found the gap between his armor plates. The second guard turned around just in time to see his partner fall, but Jay was already moving toward him. The guard tried to raise his weapon, but Jay grabbed the barrel and twisted it aside. The rifle fired harmlessly into the wall, while Jay's other hand drove the knife into the alien's throat. Blood sprayed across the corridor as the guard collapsed. Jay quickly dragged the bodies into a maintenance room and sealed the door. The other guards would not find them for hours, and by then it would be too late. He took their weapons and ammunition, then moved to his next target. The remaining 4 guards were searching the engine room when they heard the sound of their comrades' weapons firing. They rushed toward the noise, but found only empty corridors and silent. Sergeant Vok was beginning to understand that they were not dealing with an ordinary escaped prisoner. This human was moving through the ship like a ghost, striking without warning and disappearing before they could respond. Jay used the ship's own systems against the hunting party. He rerouted power to certain sections, creating darkness where he could hide and confusion where he could strike. He had learned about Vakari technology during his interrogation sessions. The third guard died when a maintenance hatch exploded outward, and Jay emerged with a plasma torch in his hands. The high energy beam cut through the alien's armor like paper, and he screamed as he burned. The fourth guard panicked and started firing wildly at shadows and sounds. His shots hit nothing but walls and equipment while Jay circled around behind him. The guard's death was quick and silent. Sergeant Vok and his remaining soldier found themselves alone in the engine room with a human killer who seemed to be everywhere at once. They stood back to back and waited for the attack they knew was coming. Jay appeared above them on a maintenance platform and threw a grenade into their midst. The explosion killed the last soldier instantly, but Vok was thrown clear with only minor injuries. He crawled toward his weapon, but Jay was already there. The sergeant looked up at the human who had destroyed his entire team and saw something in those dark eyes that made his blood freeze. This was not the expression of a desperate prisoner. This was the face of a predator who enjoyed the hunt. Jay could have killed Vok quickly, but instead he wanted information about the ship's defenses and the location of the command center. The sergeant was tough, but the human had learned many things about interrogation from his Vakari captors. When Jay was finished with his questions, he left the sergeant alive, but crippled. The alien would serve as a warning to the others about what happened when they underestimated human capabilities. Commander Drac received the news of the first team's destruction with growing concern. He had lost 6 trained warriors to a single human prisoner. This should have been impossible, but the evidence was undeniable. The second hunting party was larger and better equipped. Lieutenant Vex lead 12 soldiers through the ship using heavy weapons and advanced sensors. They were determined not to repeat the mistakes of the first team, but Jay had already moved to a different section of the ship and was waiting for them with new tactics. He had spent the time preparing traps and ambush using his knowledge of the ship's systems. The hunting party entered the cargo bay where they expected to corner the human, but instead they found themselves in a killing ground. Jay had rigged the overhead lights to explode when they entered the room. The darkness gave him a huge advantage over the aliens who relied heavily on their eyesight. He moved among them like a demon, picking them off one by one while they fired blindly at sounds and shadows. Lieutenant Vex tried to maintain order, but his soldiers were panicking. The humans seemed to be everywhere at once, and their advanced weapons were useless against an enemy they could not see. Jay had saved his personal revenge for Vex, who had been his primary torturer during the interrogation sessions. When the lieutenant found himself alone in the darkness, he knew his time had come. The fight between Jay and Vex was brutal and personal. The alien was strong and skilled, but the human was driven by weeks of pent-up rage and a desire for justice. They crashed through equipment and walls as they battled. Vex managed to wound Jay with his claws, but the human seemed to feel no pain. He fought with a fury that the alien had never encountered before. His fists and feet struck with the force of hammers, breaking bones and crushing organs. In the end, Vex lay dying on the cargo bay floor while Jay stood over him, breathing heavily. The lieutenant's last words were a question about what the human really was, but Jay did not answer. The ship's crew was now in full panic mode. 2 hunting parties had been destroyed, and the human prisoner was still free. Commander Drac realized that he was dealing with something far more dangerous than he had imagined. The remaining crew members barricaded themselves in the command center while Drac tried to figure out how to stop the human killer who was stalking through his ship. They had superior numbers and technology, but somehow that did not seem to matter. Jay retrieved Sora from her hiding place, and they began moving toward the ship's bridge. The young woman was amazed by what she had witnessed, but she was also frightened by the transformation in her rescuer. The quiet maintenance engineer was gone, and in his place was something that seemed barely human. His eyes burned with cold fire, and his movements were those of a predator who had tasted blood. The final confrontation was approaching, and Jay knew that Commander Drac would make his last stand on the bridge. The alien commander had destroyed the colony ship and killed thousands of innocent people. Now it was time for him to pay the price. The hunt was almost over, but the real battle was just beginning. The Vakari still had some advantages, but they were trapped on their own ship with a human who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain from their destruction. Commander Drac stood in the bridge of his warship and tried to understand how everything had gone so wrong. 24 hours ago, he had been in control of a powerful vessel with a crew of elite warriors. Now half his soldiers were dead and a single human prisoner was hunting the rest. The bridge was sealed with emergency barriers and defended by his remaining officers. They had the most advanced weapons on the ship and enough firepower to destroy a small planet, but somehow Drac did not feel safe. The reports coming in from the lower decks painted a picture of systematic destruction. The human was not just killing randomly, he was targeting key systems and eliminating specific crew members who had important knowledge about the ships. Operations Engineering Officer Cole had been found dead at his post with the ship's power grid sabotaged. Weapons Specialist VOR had been killed while trying to activate the defensive systems. Communications Officer Zek had died trying to send a distress signal. The human was not just fighting for survival, he was conducting a one-man war against the entire ship, and he seemed to know exactly what he was doing. The aliens were starting to understand that they had seriously underestimated their prisoner. Jay moved through the ship's corridors with Sora close behind him. She was still in shock from everything she had witnessed, but she trusted him completely. He had saved her from a fate worse than death, and she would follow him anywhere. The ship's automated defenses had been activated, but Jay knew how to bypass them. He had studied Vakari technology during his imprisonment, and he understood their weaknesses better than they realized. Force Fields blocked their path, but Jay found ways around them, using maintenance tunnels and emergency exit security cameras tracked their movement, but he disabled them with precise shots from his captured weapons. The remaining crew members were terrified, and many of them were hiding in their quarters. Instead of fighting, they had heard the stories about the human demon who could not be stopped, and they wanted no part of the battle. Jay left Sora in a secure location near the bridge and prepared for the final assault. He knew that Drac would make his last stand in the command center, surrounded by his most loyal officers. This was going to be the hardest fight yet. The bridge doors were made of reinforced metal and protected by multiple security systems, but Jay had come prepared. He placed explosive charges at key points and stepped back as the blast tore through the barriers. The explosion shook the entire ship and filled the bridge with smoke and debris. The Vakari officers opened fire immediately, but they could not see their target through the chaos. Jay rolled into the bridge using the smoke as cover. He came up behind the weapons console and fired his rifle into the group of aliens. The first shot killed the navigation officer, while the second wounded the science specialist. The battle was fierce and desperate. The aliens had superior weapons, but they were trapped in a confined space with limited room to maneuver. Jay used the bridge equipment as cover while he picked off his enemies one by one. Engineering officer that tried to flank him, but Jay was ready for the attack. He grabbed the alien's weapon and used it to beat him to death. The heavy rifle made a satisfying sound as it crushed the officer's skull. Communications specialist Vec activated the ship's internal defenses, but Jay shot him before he could complete the sequence. The alien fell across his console and his blood shorted out the electronic systems. Commander Drac found himself facing the human killer alone in the ruins of his own bridge. The other officers were dead or dying, and the ship's systems were failing around them. Drac was a veteran warrior who had fought in dozens of battles, but he had never faced anything like this. The human moved with deadly precision and seemed to anticipate every attack. The alien commander realized he was going to die. The final duel was brutal and personal. Both fighters were wounded and exhausted, but neither would give up. Drac had his claws and natural armor, while Jay had his training and unstoppable determination. Crashed through the bridge equipment as they fought, destroying consoles and displays. The ship's main screen flickered and died while sparks flew from damaged circuits. Drac managed to rake his claws across Jay's chest, but the human ignored the pain and kept fighting. He had endured weeks of torture and had watched his people die. Nothing the alien could do would make him stop. Jay's fist connected with Drac's jaw, and the alien's head snapped back with a crack. The commander staggered but remained standing. He was tougher than his subordinates and would not go down easily. The fight continued for several more minutes, with both combatants trading devastating blows. Finally, Jay managed to get behind the alien and lock his arms around Drac's throat. The commander struggled and tried to break free, but Jay's grip was like iron. The human squeezed tighter and tighter until he felt the alien's neck bones crack and separate. Drac's last words were a question about what the human really was. Jay's answer was simple and terrifying. He was human, and humans did not give up when their families were threatened. The ship's emergency systems activated as the bridge systems failed completely. The vessel was drifting without power or navigation, and the surviving crew members were hiding in the lower decks. Jay found Sora and led her to the ship's communication center, where they sent a distress signal to the human fleet. The rescue ships would arrive in 3 days, and they would find a very different situation than they expected. The few surviving Vakari crew members were found hiding in the cargo holds and storage rooms. They told stories about the human demon who had single-handedly destroyed their entire command structure. When the rescue ships arrived, they found the Vakari warship drifting in space with most of its crew dead. The bridge was a wreck, and the ship's systems had been systematically